Hello, friends, and welcome to the Iron Sharpens Iron Bible Study Podcast. First and foremost, I want to apologize about there not being an episode last week. I was feeling a bit under the weather. I believe it was probably due to allergies because here in Oklahoma, it seems like the wind has been blowing for a month straight at 20 plus miles an hour. I'm excited to be back this week. I'm feeling much better. And I'm really looking forward to getting back into our study of discipleship. And before we do get into it, I just kind of want to recap. As the Apostle Paul has been talking about discipleship in Galatians, he has spent the time talking about our individual walking with the Lord in Galatians 5:16 through 25. Paul has told us that the desires of the flesh and the desires of the Spirit, they're opposed to each other, and that by walking by the Spirit means we will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Further, Paul has pictured what the works of the flesh look like so that we would see if we are failing to walk by the Spirit. Then Paul pictured what the fruit of the Spirit looks like so we would see if we are truly walking by the Spirit. Paul has called us to crucify the flesh with its passions and desires and to keep in step with the Spirit in the spiritual, or keep in step with the Spirit in the spiritual walk. But following Jesus is not merely an individual effort. Following Jesus does not mean that we are only to look out for ourselves and only care for our own spirituality. Followers of Jesus must widen their vision to look at others as well as themselves. You know, one of the statements that we frequently use whenever it comes to trials that affect all of us, the one that most recently comes to mind is the COVID pandemic of 2020, is, we're all in this together. Because we live with such a sense of individualism in our country, the effort was to try to get people to think beyond themselves as they handle this, handle the difficult time and consider the decisions that they made in light of the fact that we are all in the same boat. This idea of being in this together is even more important when it comes to thinking about how we follow Jesus together. So in Galatians, I haven't even opened my Bible yet. In Galatians 5, we're going to start in verse 26. And I'm going to go ahead and read through chapter 6 and verse 2. That says, let us not become boastful, challenging one another, envying one another. Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. In Galatians 5:26, the Apostle Paul speaks about how we look at each other. He warns us not to become arrogant, provoking one another, or envying one another. This statement really frames what the Apostle Paul says in the first 6 verses of chapter 6. What does this look like to not be arrogant regarding one another? What does this look like to not provoke one another or envy one another? Paul is going to answer these questions and explain this in the following verses. But Paul begins in Galatians 6:1 telling us that if we see someone overtaken in any wrongdoing, to restore that person in a spirit of gentleness. The first picture that I want us to see is that we're not left to our walk of discipleship by ourselves. We're to be watching out for each other. If we see someone who has been overtaken in wrongdoing, we're supposed to do something about it. We're not supposed to sit back and think that as long as I'm watching out for myself, I'm doing good. I'm supposed to watch out for you, and you're supposed to watch out for me. The picture is that someone has unknowingly wandered off into a trap and is now caught in this wrongdoing. The person has been overtaken by this temptation. They're not intending to willingly rebel against God. Rather, they've wandered into the trap of sin. And when we see it, we're supposed to try to bring about restoration. Notice there are 2 descriptions about how this restoration should go. First, those who are spiritual should go to restore this person. There's been a lot of confusion as people wonder who are these spiritual people and what does it mean? However, our context has clarified what Paul means. The spiritual are those who are walking by the Spirit. The spiritual are those who are keeping in step with the Spirit. And this makes sense. Someone who is not keeping step with the Spirit cannot restore someone who is also not keeping in step with the Spirit. They both need restoration. So someone who is walking by the Spirit should now go to the person who is gratifying the desires of the flesh and help them. Now, notice what this restoration is supposed to look like. The restoration is supposed to be with a spirit of gentleness. This is where Galatians 5:26 comes in. If we go to that person in arrogance, we're not going to have a gentle spirit when trying to restore this one who has been caught by sin. If we have a spirit of provoking others, we're not going to have the gentle spirit needed for restoration. If we are jealous and envious, we are not going to be able to restore like God is telling us to in this text. Paul sets forward the goal for us, restoration. The goal is not winning. The goal is not being right. The goal is not saying, hey, I told you so. The goal is not implying what a better Christian we are. The goal is the soul and helping to restore the soul that has been caught. This is why we must watch out for ourselves, as Paul warns in verse 1. We will be under condemnation if we are approaching this restoration with the wrong attitude and spirit. And verse 2 amplifies this idea. We're supposed to carry each other's burdens. The context is, this situation where someone has been overcome by sin. We have a responsibility to help each other. In fact, notice that the Apostle Paul says that we're fulfilling the law of Christ when we go and try to help the one who has been caught in sin. We're fulfilling the law of Christ when we help the person get free of this entanglement. And I would say to you that the law of Christ is love. Going to help each other is love. Helping each other is fulfilling the law of Christ to love each other just as God in Christ has loved us. In the Garden of Eden, Cain asked the question, am I my brother's keeper? The answer for us is clear. We are. Friends, we need to receive this as love when someone comes to us. It's not hate, but love that they're coming to us. We're loving you by letting you know that we believe you have been overtaken by something and we want to help you. Don't be upset by the help, but grateful that you have people in your life that care for you. We don't need to practice a leave me alone faith. If we see something, we have to figure out the best way to approach you and try to help you. I'm going to move on here to verses 3 through 5. That says, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone and not in regard to another. For each one will bear his own load. Paul now gives us 3 necessary attitudes that we need as followers of Jesus so that we will not be arrogant, provoke one another, or envy one another. These 3 attitudes are expressed in verses 3 through 5 of Galatians 6. First, in verse 3, Paul warns against us thinking much of ourselves. Paul says that we are deceiving ourselves when we think that we are something. Now, it's important to understand that this is not a statement about our value or our identity. God is not trying to tell you that you have no value. We know that that's not true because God sent his son to die for us, showing how much God values each and every person. The point is about how we look at ourselves. We're not to look at ourselves as being someone or something. We need each other. Arrogance thinks that we don't need each other. Pride thinks that we can do it by ourselves. Pride thinks that we don't need to get together as much as possible, but can skip being together because we're spiritually successful. If you think that you don't need a church family, then that is pride. That, and I hate to keep using this as an example because it's now been 4 or 5 years ago. One of the terrible things that happened during COVID was the message from churches that you can just be independent. You don't have to be together. It'll be fine. And the scriptures, they really defy that way of thinking. We are dependent on each other. And further, we are completely dependent on God and have no room for boasting or pride. And I have a couple of verses here for those points. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 7 says, "For who considers you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it?" And John 15 and verse 5 says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." We need each other and we need God. The second attitude Paul wants us to have is expressed here in verse 4. As you read verse 4, you might think that it is a direct contradiction of verse 3, but Paul is telling us to enjoy our work without comparison. Pride typically comes from comparing. We think that we're better because we compare ourselves to other people. We can become boastful and arrogant when we compare our spiritual maturity or our spiritual work with others. Paul is telling us to end the comparison. It's not comparing what you are doing with others. It is about just enjoying the work God has given you to do without comparison to others. Further, Paul is telling you to grade your own work, not others. Paul doesn't tell us to test the faith of others. He doesn't tell us to test other people's works. You need to test your own work. But we really like to test other people's works, don't we? And not really to test our own. Paul would tell the Christians in Rome that the truly spiritual find their praise from God, not people, in Romans 2:29. Our walk with God is not about comparing ourselves to others. Our helping others who are overtaken by sin is not about comparing ourselves to others. Bearing the burdens of others is not about making much of ourselves. And finally, Paul reminds us in verse 5 that we all must carry our own load. While we're called in verses 1 and 2 to help one another, at the end of the day, we will be held accountable for our actions with our own loads. Testing our work is important because if we're truly evaluating our actions, we will likely not be so arrogant and not provoke others. When I see myself for who I really am with my own spiritual walk, I really don't want to compare anymore because, I have my own spiritual issues. While it is true we must help each other, it's critical that we examine our own work because we all must stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account for ourselves. We're not going to be able to blame others for our spiritual condition. Our sins belong to us and to us alone. We may have been given a bad deck of cards to play in life, but how you play those cards, it's up to you. You can't blame your parents. You can't blame your spouse, your kids, your family, your neighbors. You can't blame your church or your elders or your preacher or anyone else for how you played the cards that God gave you. It's not your past. It's not your upbringing. It's not what people have done to you. It's you. You have to carry your own load. You must give an account. I say this to so many people who have been given a bad deck of cards to play in life. Don't let them ruin your life. Don't let them ruin your eternity. Why would we let those who have hurt us and disappointed us continue to have power over us so that we don't enjoy the future that God is giving us? Why are you letting the past ruin your today and ruin your tomorrow? Carry the load that you've been given. God has put us in the wilderness and he's testing our hearts to reveal our faith to see if we follow him or not. So let's pull these ideas together as we think about discipleship. We're connected together and we're showing love by watching out for each other. We fulfill the law of Christ as we choose to help each other when we are overtaken by wrongdoing. If you're walking by the Spirit, then help those that have fallen into temptation and do it with a spirit of gentleness. But how do we keep from falling into arrogance, pride, provoking others, and envying others? Don't think of yourself as something before God. test your work. Know you will be held accountable for carrying your own load. With these attitudes, we can work together and walk together as we learn, as we love and serve the Lord. I hope and pray that as we're going through this study of discipleship, that you're really getting as much out of it as I am. That's really all that I've got for this week. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And until our next sharpening session, stay steadfast, stay inspired, and may your faith continue to grow sharper each day. This is the Iron Sharpens Iron Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Goad. And until next week, God bless.